thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, of course, for inviting me to give this seminar for earthquake. So it is the Maduo earthquake, which I'm going to talk about today, along with some other earthquakes I've been working on before this one. And this work I've been doing mainly as a JPL postdoc, but also part of my PhD. So here you have, I acknowledge the work from collaborators from JPL, IPGP, and also UC Berkeley, which I've been working with for some years. So let's start with just a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So a general introduction on fault deformation processes and why do we need this high resolution optical image correlation method. I'll go through some methodology aspects of this. And then we'll spend some time on the observations we have made on the case of the Maduo earthquake before we look at some other observations for other earthquake and try to have a bigger picture of the processes we were analyzing. And then I will look into the impact of the data resolution on the measurements we are making, especially from the perspective of NASA incubation program I've been working for, and what are the data needs for a future observation system. And I will conclude this presentation. So if we start from a field perspective, when an earthquake occurs, and we talk about continental earthquakes, nothing which is too deep or nothing which is underwater. When an earthquake in continental platforms occurs and ruptures the ground surface, it usually triggers deformation that is much more complex in geometry and in space than what we simplify as usually the fault slip plus elastic medium. This is a drone image that we have taken on the Bulnai rupture, which was in Mongolia in 1905. So we went there in 2019. And we have this very nice image where you can see that the primary direction of faulting is east-west, and it's a left lateral earthquake, a strike slip earthquake. But the deformation we see at the surface are those oblique tension cracks, which can cross-cut each other or not. And so the work we do as a field earthquake geologist at first is to try to measure the surface deformation on all of those faults and try to assess what are the types of deformation as well. Do we only have deformation on the faults, or do we see some more distributed deformation around? However, this is a very difficult task because for many earthquakes, most of them, what we encounter is wide and distributed surface deformation, which means that you have faults and fractures that distribute over areas which are sometimes more than 1 kilometer wide over the entire length of the earthquake ruptures, which goes from a few tens to a few hundreds of kilometers. So here I show two examples. This is one of the Monte Cristo earthquake in Nevada in 2020, where you have all those fractures that go in different directions. And here the Maduo Tibet earthquake, which we're going to talk about a lot today, where in the epicenter region, only those blue scattered fractures could be really measured, along with some secondary lateral spreading features. And this is how it looks sometimes in the field. So one main question, how wide is the surface deformation associated with that earthquake? How can we make sure that we grasp and we measure the entirety of the surface in elastic deformation? And second question, what are the mechanisms and the controls of that awful deformation, all of that deformation that doesn't occur on the visible faults at the surface? In the end, it appears that globally, if we look at many earthquakes, those very wide, kilometer-wide deformation zones are pretty common. They have been characterized based on field data or aftershock data, where we see the evolution of the deformation with distance to the primary fault. So these are field small fractures, distributed fractures, and these are aftershocks that highlight the places where there is potentially fault damage. And this brought us to evolve from the initial sketch of Mitchell and Faulkner characterizing exhumed fault cores as like a fault core and the damage zone around of about 100 or a few hundreds of meters, to this view of what happens during a coseismic rupture at the surface, that actually the surface deformation zone might be even wider, might be several kilometers wide, involving inelastic deformation of the belt medium over these very, very large scales. So this has two main consequences for our work. First, this kind of mechanism will affect the belt mechanical properties over wide regions. And so it will affect the fault behavior, its mechanical behavior, and the earthquake cycle, whether you're going to have bigger earthquakes, smaller earthquakes, more creep or not. So we got to understand better all of this bulk versus fault slip interactions to be able to characterize better the mechanisms, the behavior of the faults, the different faults. So two main questions in my talk I raise is first, what are the interactions between fault slip and bulk yielding? And second, what controls those interactions? So as I said, in the field, it is pretty complicated to have a global view of the deformation mechanisms because of the physical limitations of fieldwork, the scales of the processes, and also the fact that many of them, sometimes the deformation is occurring at such a small scale that it's not really visible with our own eyes, like bulk microscale deformation. So geodetic methods have been used now for some time to measure the earthquake displacements, to characterize both what's happening at depth using the inversion methods, but also to characterize the fault zone deformation behaviors. So pretty common methods are the INSAR and the SAR pixel offsets, which are used to really constrain the source behavior at depth using the inversion methods, and those are really accurate in the far field. However, they have a pretty low ground resolution based on the globally available products and the multi-looking methods. And especially INSAR decorrelates close to the faults where the displacement gradients are too high. So this is why optical image correlation is used to really be able to measure the displacement at the fault, despite the fact that the gradients can be very high, it never decorrelates and beneficiates from the high resolution of the commercial satellite datasets. Commercial or not, sorry. So, well, this is an example on what we have done for the case of the Ridgecrest earthquake, which was an earthquake in California, but I will show you how we have applied this method to Maduo. So optical image correlation is a method to measure the displacement between pixels of pre and post-earthquake ortho images. So an ortho image is just an optical image which has been corrected from the distortions of the satellite viewing angle. That method, as I said, benefits from the high resolution of satellite optical sensors from about 0.3 meters to 15 meters ground resolution. And there is no decorrelation close to the fault. We are, though, subject to decorrelation due to surface processes or meteor clouds or water, but quite similar to what INSAR is being affected by. One specificity of working at higher resolution, so most of the data sets which are below 3 meters ground resolution, they are acquired as non-nadir images, which means that they have a non-vertical viewing angle towards the ground, and they have huge distortions due to that viewing angle. So this is an example of two different images on the city of Ridgecrest in California, and you can really see the distortions due to the parallax in the image because the satellite was looking at two different directions. So one job we have to do to be able to work with those high resolution data is to correct for those distortions using digital elevation models, which we call, as I said before, image ortho rectification. Though the globally available DMs are usually too low resolution accuracy for the purpose we have, so we derive ourselves stereo DMs from the optical images we have before and after the earthquake. So in most of my work, I am using the Micmac photogrammetry and correlation software, but you can do the same kind of work with also ASP for the photogrammetry or COSICOR for the correlation. So the complete pipeline for measuring the horizontal displacement involves, as I said in the first part, constructing DSMs for the pre-earthquake and the post-earthquake period. If you want to construct your own DSM, you need to have at least 2 images before and 2 images after, which is a requirement. If you don't, there are other methods to go around this problem, but you can have more noise. Second, when you have those DSMs, you can correct your images doing the ortho rectification, so projecting all of your images in a similar ground reference using the DSMs of respectively before and after the earthquake. Once you have done that, you can finally measure the ground displacement that occurred between the first and the second image acquisition before and after, and that ground displacement hopefully is dominantly the earthquake rupture. So you do that displacement by doing a statistical approach of looking at all of the best corresponding pixels within a search window. Some other methods work with frequency correlations, for example, as coseismic. This one is statistical. Something else I haven't mentioned, I'm not really going to show results today, but you can also measure the vertical displacement from differencing the pre and the post-earthquake DSMs, and that works very well. It's pretty accurate on low noise, especially if you have the high-resolution submeter data. So let's now talk about the Maduo earthquake. So that earthquake is a 7.4 earthquake that ruptured an intra-block fault south of the major Kunlun fault, which is pretty famous. So it's not a fault on which there is a lot of historical earthquake. It's not a very well-known or studied area. So when that earthquake occurred in 2021, people, especially Chinese groups, went into the field and mapped the entire rupture, which is about 160 kilometers long. The main observations based on the field was that the rupture is very distributed in space, and there's many places where we could not see actual ruptures, just a few secondary distributed features, and that the primary faulting is really only occurring in a few regions. You can see the offsets that have been measured in the field up to sometimes 2.6 meters, which is pretty high, but this is very local. On average, surface slip is very small. So that was one main question associated with that earthquake is where is this deformation occurring? What's happening where there is those rupture gaps? Is there actual surface deformation or not? So this is where the geodetic imaging comes into play. So these are just examples of INSAR and SAR offset pixel offset tracking that have been published by Liu et al. 2022 to give an idea of the large-scale displacements. And this is what we have done using Sentinel-2 to compare with the SAR pixel offset tracking and with the higher resolution spot and Pleiades images. So we combine here data from 1.6 to 0.5 ground resolution. And we have made the choice of upsampling everything at 0.5, which was less noisy. If we zoom into that result here of the spot and Pleiades data, this is how the east-west displacement map look. I'm not showing the north-south because it's mainly noise. It's a very minor displacement component. Most of the displacement is occurring in this east-west component. So in this map, you can recognize those places where the deformation is very narrow at the surface. So the transition between the blue, the reddish zone, which goes westward, and the bluish zone that goes eastward is the fault zone. So everything that is whitish in the center is the fault zone. And here, for example, the fault zone is very narrow, and it corresponds to where people in the field saw primary faults before. If we take a zoom in that window here, for example, this is the fault mapping from the Chinese groups, and the displacement maps where we can see this fault zone transition in whitish here, which is very sharp here and wider in that area where, as well in the field, more distributed faulting was observed. If we move to other regions where it is very, very broad and we no primary faults could be seen in the field, this is what we call more diffuse deformation. So it is just a very wide offset of displacement across the fault zone, pretty continuous. And in the field, this is the map I showed in the introduction, just a few distributed fractures, but no main fault. So we use displacement profiles to measure the displacement and the deformation across the fault zone along the entire rupture and try to analyze how did the deformation mechanisms evolve along the strike of the Maduo rupture, because as we saw, there are more localized and more diffuse deformation features. So if we have here 4 profiles, AA prime here along this primary fault, then BB prime and CC prime are over the slightly more distributed regions, and DD prime is across the diffuse deformation region. If you look at all of these profiles, you can really see differences between that very localized, almost subvertical offset that is the slip on the primary fault, and those slightly wider regions around it that is what we call the near-fault off-fault deformation. This near-fault off-fault deformation corresponds to what is commonly characterized as OFD in the papers, and where people look at offsets in the optical imagery of a few hundreds of meters wide, and they compare that with the slip measured in the field. So we have other examples here of this wider deformation, and here, for example, where there is one fault on one side and then just off-fault deformation on the other one. And finally, there is this very surprising, very large-scale diffuse deformation offset that is still about 1.5 meters in amplitude. So this is a large amount of displacement, but it occurs over an area of about 1 kilometer. So this is what we called the diffuse deformation. We do this analysis every 200 meters, so 247 profiles we have analyzed in total along the entire length of the Maduo earthquake. And here's the displacement budget we've built. So in black is the total offset across the fault zone. And within this area, we have separated the localized deformation on the faults in red, the near fault off-fault deformation, and the larger scale diffuse deformation in blue. Below that is the plot of the total fault zone width that evolves from very localized, where most of the deformation occurs in the fault, to very, very wide in those places where the deformation is essentially diffuse. What was interesting in that plot is that we see that we have almost bimodal behavior of the surface deformation for that earthquake, with the central area where most of the deformation is diffuse, and we have this very broad shear zone, not much fractures, which we still got to understand what are the mechanisms of this deformation, and the size of the rupture, so about plus or minus 30 kilometers on either side of the epicenter, where we have more localized deformation on the faults and also more coseismic deformation at the surface. The total displacement is larger on the sides and smaller in the center. So to go further in that analysis, what we have done is that we have measured the displacement gradient for each of those deformation regions we have seen in the profile using the offsets and the width of the offsets we have measured. So this displacement gradient is basically a first order estimate of the strain. And it works very well because the amplitudes we have correspond very well with what other groups obtain for actual strain measurements, so deriving the strain tensor and extracting the shear or the rotation. So here this displacement gradient goes from 0 to more than 510 under actually very localized regions, but statistically, we saw that the diffuse off-fault deformation is mostly below 0.3, especially in the epicenter area. And then the near-fault off-fault deformation between 0.3 and 1%, and the localized deformation is, of course, above 1% and more, almost infinite. So for the localized and near-fault off-fault deformation, this is not very unexpected, but what is really unexpected is for the diffuse off-fault deformation, it has extremely low surface deformation gradients. Here, the example of this is the same profile as the one I've shown 2 slides before. The gradient is about 0.1%. So this is really below what we call the inelastic deformation threshold, which is usually 0.5% and is derived from laboratory experiment and widely used in geodetic studies to characterize whether the deformation is elastic or inelastic. So here we have deformation at the surface, large amplitude, large distribution in space that is below this theoretical inelastic deformation threshold. So first possibility, either it corresponds to elastic strain. But the problem is that if it is elastic strain, you will need at some point to have surface after slip or creep to account for it. And there is no evidence for the Maduo earthquake and for all of the other earthquakes we've been working on that any after slip or creep would account for the amount of diffuse deformation we have measured at the surface. So the other possibility is that this diffuse deformation is inelastic deformation, but in this case, it means that we have to reconsider the thresholds we're using and the understanding of the processes we have. So to look into this and to understand whether the diffuse deformation can indeed be inelastic or not, we have predicted the closeness to failure within the bulk medium around the folds. So we do that by first using a displacement profile constrained by all of the inversions which were published. We have this buried, shallow slip buried profile here. We predict the elastic displacement. We predict the bulk displacement using the elastic assumption, and we predict, we measure what is the stress change in the bulk and whether using a yield stress criteria, whether this stress overcomes or not the bulk yield stress. So these are very simple mechanical formulations. There is no complexity in that model. We've been testing it around for different geometries and parameters, but it is a very stable and very simple model. So this is the zoom into the result that shows that for the slip distribution that was inferred at the place of the epicenter, where we have this entirely diffuse deformation, we do have bulk yielding at the surface. All of this bluish area is likely bulk yielding. I forgot to add the color scale, but the color scale here was going over. So once you get into this dark blue area, you are over 10 times of the bulk yield stress. So it means that it's not only possible, but it is very highly likely that that shallow area above the fold yielded during the coseismic rupture. The scale of the yielding here is quite consistent with what we have seen in the observations, though it is very susceptible to change if you calibrate the model using the right shear bulk modulus curve and how it evolves with the depth. So we have shown that bulk yielding is indeed possible in the conditions of the Maduo earthquake, and especially in the epicenter area. And from that, we have done other tests of this model using deeply buried slip distribution, the shallow buried, as in the epicenter, partial surface rupture, where you have about 50% shallow slip deficit, and a complete thoroughgoing surface rupture. And we have used that to along with the scaling laws we have derived for the localized, near-fold, off-fold deformation, and localized deformation, a conceptual model of how should the surface deformation evolve along a fold zone, depending on the amount of surface strain. So basically, in the places where you have the lowest surface strain and the rupture is buried at very, very large depth, you will have just an elastic response of the medium. And this is it's everywhere around the actual rupture zone. Then, if you increase the surface strain on the shallow folds, you increase the shallow slip and you increase the surface strain in the bulk, you start having diffuse deformation. So what we have inferred as potentially elastoplastic bulk yielding. And increasing again the strain, you start having more fractures at the surface because you start to localize slightly more deformation at the surface. And at some point, if you increase even more the slip, you start having primary fault zone at the surface. Here in this sketch, we propose that we show that the diffuse deformation zone decreases with increasing slip, whereas the primary, the localized deformation increases with increasing slip towards a maximum. At some point, the width of the fold zone saturates. So this is what is usually characterized as the fold core plus the damage zone, which is dynamically triggered by the earthquake and increases with increasing slip. So first, conclusions on this: bulk yielding is possible. It generates low strain between 0.1 and 0.3% surface diffuse deformation, and it becomes significant in regions of lesser coseismic deformation. So from that observation, now it comes to the big question of, does this diffuse deformation can account for more globally the shallow slip deficit that is inferred for continental earthquakes? So we'll look at other case studies that we've been working on and see what is the answer. So this is the Ridge-Crest earthquake, for which I've shown the optical image correlation in introduction. That was work I've done during my PhD. And more recently, what we have, so for that earthquake, what we inferred is that there was a lot of diffuse deformation. So more recently, we have done a joint inversion of the INSAR, GNSS, and the optical offset to build a more refined rupture model with very well constrained shadow slip distribution using these optical offsets. And the question we were asking for the earthquake is how the SSD is accounted for. So indeed, if you look at the left plot here, for the foreshock and the main shock earthquake, we have there is a very large shadow slip deficit for that earthquake. It is about 50% for the foreshock and 30% for the main shock. And this is not an artifact because it is very well constrained using the optical data. So we have measured from independent data the amount of diffuse deformation at the surface, which actually was a very good surprise that it fits entirely the amount of shadow slip deficit for the main shock. For the foreshock, the diffuse deformation, which is in gray here, so the total surface displacement is reported with those squares. For the foreshock, it doesn't really entirely account for the shadow slip deficit. But for the case of the main shock, it was really interesting, and that's where we inferred that for this earthquake especially, the shadow slip deficit is fully accounted by the diffuse deformation. So in the end, there is no deficit of coseismic surface deformation. And this is a sketch that we came up with at that time that is very consistent with what I showed you before, which are more recent models we have done. For the case of the foreshock, though, the fact that the diffuse deformation does not entirely account for the SSD is most likely because the foreshock is closer to what we have shown before as a small, deeply buried rupture, where the surface deformation is partly elastic as well. Only some part of the inelastic deformation reaches the surface. So from that observation, we've been looking at whether there is a correlation between SSD and diffuse deformation more broadly. So we have used all of the different case studies we had, Maduo, Balochistan, and we have separated the SSD and diffuse deformation for the different segments of the Ridgecrest earthquake. And overall, what we observed is a pretty good positive correlation between those two quantities with a coefficient that is between 0.5 and 1. It's not too far from 1. And so we used that correlation to look at more globally how shadow slip deficit is evolving and how potentially shadow belt yielding is evolving for different earthquake. So using a synthesis of SSD values for 29 rupture models worldwide, we have measured how much SSD there is in all of those models and plotted against the earthquake magnitude. We have not really measured the SSD. I'm sorry, we extracted the values from the published models or just the numbers from the publications. So for all of those events which represent continental earthquakes for which there is good enough data that the SSD was well constrained, we really see this evolution from very high, like more than 50% SSD for all the small magnitude earthquakes, and small in this context cycle, everything that is below 7.8, 7.9. And most of the earthquakes which are above this 7 magnitude have a lower SSD and slightly lower for the biggest earthquakes. So that makes sense if you consider that greater coseismic energy for larger magnitude earthquakes would allow for a greater localization of the deformation at the surface. You have more slip, you have bigger slip areas, so your slip patch is more likely to reach the surface and localize maximum slip in the top of the crest. So SSD and diffuse deformation are more significant for smaller magnitude earthquakes. Of course, this relation has to be modulated by the specific parameters of each rupture. It has the seismic history, the belt lithology, the fault geometry, but this is a good first order analysis that can be used as a first order analysis. So from that, we derive a very simple sketch of how the fault zone deformation should evolve for earthquakes of different magnitudes, which kind of is the same as what we derived for just the case of the Maduo earthquake. So the message here is the same, is that the localization of the surface deformation depends on the amount of surface strain that evolves as a function of coseismic slip. And so coseismic slip is on the first order controlled by the earthquake magnitude. So for very large earthquakes, you would have a thick fault core and damage zone and a very localized rupture. And this is an example here of a geodetic imaging of the Balochistan earthquake. I could also cite the Kokok City earthquakes or others in this range. For intermediate magnitude earthquakes, more distributed faults and some diffuse deformation. So here's another image of El Mayor Cucapa, where you have this diffuse deformation and you have different subparallel faults. The Ridgecrest is another of those examples, or Landers as well. And finally, those smaller magnitude earthquakes, including, for example, the case of the Napa, so this is a 6.4, where you likely have more distributed fracturing at the surface and a wide bulk and a wide bulk yielding deformation, but not that much primary faults at the surface. So my main conclusions from this first part is that what we show is a continuum of surface deformation processes. We are not in the configuration where there is elastic deformation of the medium and slip on the fault. There is a broad range of deformation that occurs around, including this near fault off-fault deformation, where usually is well characterized. There is a lot of fractures. It can be visible in the field, but it's also highly visible in the imaging. And this larger scale diffuse that requires looking at a broader scale at the surface deformation and is lower strain. So it is also discussed whether it can be elastic or inelastic, and that might depend on the different earthquakes, as I said. So diffuse deformation likely accommodates the surface deformation in regions of lesser fault slip. It likely corresponds to diffuse microscale plastic deformation associated with low strain. It is controlled by the amount of shallow slip and locally by variations in fault frictional properties, bulk, mechanical properties on fault geometry. So these have two main implications. I said in introduction for the impacts on the rheology and frictional behavior of the fault zone, which has to be characterized. And second, which is another important one, has implications for the estimations of earthquake magnitude based on surface slip observations. Because if you have a possibly larger bias on the surface slip that is measured for small earthquake because of the relatively wider bulk deformation, that might create a bias in the surface observations we have. Though this remains to be investigated. I'm not saying that there is a bias on all of the data we have. So I will jump on the last part of my talk, saying that all of the work I have shown you before and how it is bringing new observations on fault deformation behavior is really relying on the data availability and access for different areas of the world and different timings and different institutions. So especially when it comes to higher resolution products for optical, but also for SAR, most of the data are held by private sectors or public sectors, but which keep it within specific agreements. So it has an impact on how science can be done, as an open science can be done everywhere and equally. And so I've been working when I was at JPL, and I still work for this incubation program, which is called Surface Topography and Vegetation program, for looking at constructing a future surface topography mission with open data and global coverage, and eventually doing this with an optical sensor, which would mean that we would be able to have a high resolution stereo imaging of the entire Earth available everywhere. So to do so, what we've been doing is look at the impact of the data characteristics on the measurement and the understanding of the physical processes, because we need to understand what are the data gaps and how to best fulfill those gaps with the future observations. We have been working from the solid Earth tectonics and especially fault deformation perspective, but there are different groups working in all of those different regions as well, applications as well. So doing so, we have worked again on the case of Maduo, because we had tons of data on that earthquake from different sensors, and we have looked at the impact of the image resolution. So we will focus on a small area of the rupture where there was enough diversity in the ground fault, on the ground geometry, and whether it is localized or diffuse, that within the same measurement we have an idea of how much precision and accuracy and complexity we can retrieve. We have done measurements for different sensors. Here I show examples of world view, spot Pleiad, as we talked about previously, the planet and the sentinel, and we have compared as well with results from SAR. And for each of the case study, we make profiles, we do the displacement budget, we measure the fold zone displacement and the fold zone width. And so you can see for this first example how you decrease the resolution of the measurement and how you have a hard time to characterize the fold geometry in the low resolution product, which is not a surprise, but we're trying to get a more refined understanding of what's the best resolution and what are the mechanisms at play. If you derive the rotation from the displacement tensor, you have an even better idea of how the strain on the fold is best retrieved using the different data sets. And you can see that when you start from about 3 meters at planet data and then Sentinel-2 data, you really smooth out the entire signal. My main message from that would be that doing surface deformation analysis using low resolution data sets has limitations. So we have done this work again using resampled data sets to get rid of the differences in the sensors and just work with the difference in the resolution. So we have down sampled the world view images, and we have also upsampled the sentinel and tried different parameters. And what you observe is overall almost a linear increase of the background noise with decreasing image resolution. That can be, of course, mitigated using different correlation parameters or different smoothing methods, but you will always lose some information and you will not recover the detail and the complexity that you can measure with the high resolution. So if you finally, we have also tested the impact of the topography on the displacement maps. So here at the top, you have images auto-rectified using the stereo DSMs at different ground resolutions. The results are all pretty good. And at the bottom is using the globally available bare Earth DMs, so NASA DEM and Copernicus DEM. And this is what I mentioned in the introduction. Those DMs don't have the accuracy and the ground resolution for the purpose of the kind of studies we are doing. So finally, when looking at the evolution of the fold zone displacement we have measured in all of the different data sets and all of the different tests we see on average a slight decrease in the amount of surface slip that is measured, and potentially about 20 to 30% bias in the displacement when using the low resolution data sets. Not mentioning also the highly increasing epistemic uncertainty due to the higher noise and then the choice that the operator has to do using the lower resolution products. So I will conclude on that presentation and on my talk in general, saying that the high resolution stereo optical imagery combined with the correlation techniques really fills a data gap between the field observations, which are mainly on the folds, and the other geodetic data sets, which are broader scale, so essentially SAR and GNSS. I didn't talk about LiDAR, which has an extremely good spatial resolution, but is not really applicable on a global scale, nor from satellite mission. So applied to the case of earthquakes, those new observations revealed fold zone deformation processes, and the fact that for Maduo, but for other earthquakes we've been working on, low strain inelastic belt deformation participates to the earthquake deformation budget, and it accounts for a lack of surface slip. Finally, it has numerous other applications for the monitoring of surface processes on Earth and other planets. Glaciers, dunes, and landslides are very good examples. So if you're interested in this kind of applications, you can check out what STV has been doing in the last years. And thank you very much for your attention. be happy to have some questions.
Thanks so much, Solène. That was a really interesting talk and some really fabulous results that you were able to share with us today. We do have a few questions that have come in already from the audience, but I would encourage those of you that are tuning in live, if you have a question, please feel free to go ahead and type that into the Q&A box, and I can go through these and read them aloud for our speaker to respond to. Our first question here, so this is a really great talk. In calculating the shallow stress perturbation and the potential inelastic yielding, did you consider depth-dependent variation in shear modulus or rigidity? And what is the rigidity value used for shallow near-surface depth?
So in that model that I showed, no, we have used a very generic value of 30 GPa, though we have tried it down to 10 GPa. And we have made others, so we have estimated, I didn't show here, but we have estimated for a wide range of changing shear modulus how this area would evolve. And overall, what I would say is that the shear modulus can be very small at the surface, down to a few GPa, and it evolves non-linearly towards depth. And this is very dependent on the material. Some materials have an evolution of several 100%, and some others within 20 to 30% of their shear modulus. So it will definitely impact. But especially impact the scale of that yielding area.
So maybe a somewhat related question came in having to do with the terminology. This individual says, great talk. I might have missed something at the beginning, but we usually think of bulk inelastic yielding as taking place when strains are so high that they exceed the elastic limit. But you detect inelastic yielding in the lower strain parts of the rupture with high diffuse deformation. How are these related? I guess maybe just some of the terminology.
Yeah, so it is related, and that's something that was really hard to understand all the mechanisms at the same time. So I didn't bring in that presentation the scaling laws, but this is what I've tried to mention here in this graph. The fact that if you have low surface strain, as we showed this 0.1, 0.3%, it is usually considered as elastic deformation. As I said, there is no creep, no after sleep. So we're trying to understand, is it really elastic or can it be inelastic? And the calculations we've done show that even at low strain, the stress that is associated with that low strain is large enough to overcome the potential yield stress of the shallow crust. However, there's another mechanism which is at play, and it's closer to the fold zone. When you have the slip that gets closer to the surface, you would have higher strain, of course, in the process zone of the rupture. And these are likely more related to the dynamic stresses as well that are very high. And then you would do more like damage. You would just damage the entire medium around the folds. So those two mechanisms are at play, and we think that bulk yielding is dominant where slip is very small, and the effect of dynamic stress is very small as well, and that the damage would be dominant for bigger earthquakes. And that's why we've drawn this thicker fold zone here, whereas the fold it's quite small at the beginning, because the more slip you will have, the thicker the core and the damage zone will be. And these are the observations from Faulkner. If I go back to the introduction, these are the tool scales. This is the fold core and the damage zone, which is dominantly controlled by the fold slip. But this is the yielding area around it that here is mostly controlled by how much residual strain there is in the all-fault medium. I hope.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think that gets at it. So thanks for addressing that. A question here next that says, great talk. For the optical data you use for this research, is it the Sentinel-2 10-meter resolution or joint with the spots data? I don't exactly know what that means, but they go on further to say, for the Sentinel-2 with 10-meter resolution, to get a very accurate displacement in this research, less than 2 meters or so, do you think enhanced image resolution, so higher resolution than 10 meters, is completely needed?
So the answer is yes, and so for the first answer is no, and the second answer is yes. First, the work I have shown is based on the Spot and Pleiades results. So it is a combined ground resolution of 1.6 and 0.5 meter to do the full deformation analysis we have done. And this is quite necessary if you want to do this type of analysis, as I've shown in the sensitivity study in the end. The Sentinel-2 result, though, were very good for giving a first-order estimation of how much sleep and how much global large-scale awful deformation occurred, because with the Sentinel-2, you can retrieve pretty well this black curve. So the black curve can be retrieved well, but you won't be able to have an accurate measurement of this red area, which is the localized deformation, and to make this full analysis.
Okay, I would encourage folks, if you do have any last minute questions, feel free to send those in. I did want to ask, as a seismologist, I'm curious to know if you've looked at earthquake source time functions. So for recent earthquakes, if you looked at earthquake source time functions to see if some other rupture characteristics, so things like the amount of slip, rupture speed, things like that, have any significant correlations with the slip localization, sort of this continuum that you've described for us.
Yes, so one parameter that has an impact, we think, is definitely the speed of the earthquake. The faster the earthquake is going to be, the more localized the deformation is going to be, because the dynamic stress area around the rupture is going to be much more intense, but narrower. And we have done this work for the case of the Kokoxili earthquake. That was a paper published about 2 years ago, where we looked at the evolution of the awful deformation across the transition from subshear to super shear, and we could see that where it transitions, there is a much narrower folds and width. For the case of Maduo, I've been raising that hypothesis, but it's still hard because there is not enough data to support it. But what I thought is that where there is the place of the hypocenter, where the rupture is actually has lower sleep and has a smaller velocity, it doesn't manage to rupture and propagate all the sleep up to the surface, and so it does shallow belt yielding. And it takes to the rupture a few tens of kilometers to develop fully and have more sleep, more velocity, and then only you can localize all the deformation on the folds. So that is.
Have you seen any of the slip models for this earthquake? Is it a bilateral rupture where, I mean, it starts in the middle, or does it go at different times? Or?
It is a bilateral rupture. It goes on the sides pretty symmetrically, and the raise time to go up to the maximum of the maximum of the source time function is about a few seconds, and it corresponds to about 20-30 kilometers distance. That's why I was thinking about this. By the time the earthquake arrives at its peak of momentum, it is at about this distance. Okay. So yeah, but I think there are studies looking into this in more detail, like using actual modeling, but I have not.
Very interesting stuff. I appreciate you entertaining the question. Okay, just one final question here, inquiring about how you mentioned, research is ongoing and stuff. How much do you know about the research at Caltech in particular? Is anyone there, or are you planning to take on students that are going to be working on this work, or are there other institutions that are doing similar work that might be accepting students?
So JPL has a program for internships, and they do offer internships in the summer. I don't really know how, but people can apply for this. There's tons of students getting into JPL every year. It gets pretty crowded and fun. Caltech, there is the SURF programs as well. So with Jean-Philippe, we're discussing it. I don't know yet. We've had a few applications, but If people are interested, just feel free to reach out. I guess us or other people might be interested. And then other institutions, I don't really know about it. I would just say if you want to have internship, just reach out to people and yeah, opportunities will come.